Fleeing the guards, I accidentally entered the Queen's chamber. What I discovered left me frozen. Part 1. The Trespasser. Callum Ward had survived 2 tours on Mars, a failed first contact with the Dranaki, and a bar fight on Station Omega that left him with a scar across his jaw and a story he never got tired of telling. But none of that had prepared him for the moment a 7-foot mantis warrior decided he needed to die for looking at someone the wrong way. It had been such a small thing, a glance, nothing more, just his eyes drifting upward during the palace tour, and landing on the face of a Velihari highborn who was passing through the corridor above them on a suspended walkway. And in that single heartbeat of eye contact, Callum had broken one of the most sacred laws of the Velihari Dominion. A lesser species does not look upon a highborn. He did not get a warning. He did not get a chance to apologize. He got the sound of chitons scraping against steel. Chitin, as 2 Shelkari royal guards dropped from the ceiling like pale nightmares and drew their bone blades with a wet click that echoed through the living walls of the corridor. "Run!" his translator whispered in his ear, converting the pheromone burst the guards had released into a single human word. And Callum did not need to be told twice. He ran. The hallways of the Velihari Palace were not like human hallways. They were alive. Every surface was made of a thick organic material that breathed and pulsed with a slow rhythm like the heartbeat of something impossibly large. The walls were warm and slightly damp, and they glowed with a soft blue-green bioluminescence that shifted as he moved. And the worst part was that they responded to the guards behind him. The Shelkari released pursuit pheromones as they ran, and the corridor itself began to change. Walls tightened, doorways sealed shut with wet sucking sounds, side passages closed like throats swallowing. The entire palace was trying to trap him, like a white blood cell closing around a virus. And Callum realized with a cold spike of terror that this building was not a building at all. It was an organism, and it was hunting him. But Callum was human, and humans had spent their entire evolutionary history being hunted by things bigger and faster and deadlier than them. And they had survived every single time, not because they were stronger, but because they were unpredictable. He grabbed a hanging tendril of bioluminescent tissue and swung himself upward into a gap between the ceiling and the wall, a narrow space that no Velihari would ever think to use because their bodies were too rigid and too large. He squeezed through on his belly, feeling the warm, wet surface press against his back, and he crawled, fast and desperate. While below him, the Shelkari guards clattered past in confusion, their compound eyes scanning the corridor and finding nothing. Corridors away, and kept moving, his heart slamming against his ribs, sweat running down his face and mixing with the strange, sweet-smelling moisture that coated every surface of the hive palace. He turned left, then right, then left again, using no pattern, following no logic, just letting his gut drag him forward through the maze of breathing tunnels. Behind him, he could hear more guards joining the hunt, their clicking communication echoing through the halls like a language made of bones breaking. His translator picked up fragments. "The animal is loose, and find it before it contaminates the upper levels, and authorized for immediate culling." And that last phrase hit him like a punch to the stomach, because it confirmed what he already knew. They were not trying to arrest him. They were trying to kill him, and they would not lose sleep over it, because to the Velihari, killing a human was no different from stepping on an insect. It was pest control, it was hygiene, was nothing. Callum turned a corner and found a dead end, a smooth, curved wall of living tissue with no openings, no gaps, nothing but a single sealed membrane door that pulsed with a faint red glow, which his training told him meant restricted access, which his survival instinct told him meant anywhere but here is death. He could hear the guards behind him, close now, their bone blades clicking in anticipation, and he made his choice in less than a second. He drove his shoulder into the membrane door. It resisted, the organic material stretching like skin, warm and horrible against his body. And then it tore, splitting open with a sound like ripping meat, and Callum stumbled through and fell hard on his hands and knees on the other side. And behind him, the membrane sealed itself shut with a speed that nearly caught his boot, closing up like a wound healing in fast forward. He was in darkness. Total, complete, warm darkness. Here, thick and humid and filled with a scent his translator could not identify. Something old and deep and alive. Something that made his hindbrain light up with a warning that was older than language, older than thought. A warning that said, "You are in the presence of something immense." The bioluminescence began to grow, slowly, like a sunrise made of pale green light, spreading across the ceiling and walls of a chamber so vast that Callum could not see the far side. It was enormous, cathedral huge, the ceiling arching upward into shadow, and the walls curved inward, like the inside of an egg. And every surface was covered in a network of pulsing tendrils that carried light and fluid and something else, something that hummed at a frequency he could feel in his teeth. And then he saw her. At the center of the chamber, suspended in a web of those pulsing tendrils, was the largest living thing Callum had ever seen. She was 60 feet long at least, color, segmented and elegant in a way that was terrible and beautiful at the same time. She had dozens of eyes, each one the size of a dinner plate, arranged in clusters across a head that was crowned with structures of gleaming dark metal. The queen of the Valihari dominion, the matriarch divine, the living goddess worshipped by trillions across 1,000 worlds. But something was wrong. Her body was thin, too thin, the segments of her torso showing gaps where flesh had wasted away. The tendrils that held her were not supporting her. They were restraining her, piercing her carapace at dozens of points, and feeding tubes of dark fluid into her body. And the metal crown on her head was not a crown at all. Callum could see it now. It was a device, bolted and fused into her skull, with cables running from it into the walls of the chamber, and it pulsed with a rhythm that was not her own. She was not ruling from this chamber. She was imprisoned in it, stood there, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, breathing hard, covered in the slime of a living palace that wanted him dead. And he stared at the chained goddess of an alien empire. And for the first time in his life, Sergeant Callum Ward had absolutely no idea what to do next. The Queen's eyes opened, all of them, dozens of wet dark orbs focusing on him at once, and the chamber filled with a sound he had never heard before. A voice that crackled and broke like something that had not been used in a very long time, speaking words his translators scrambled to process. "You are small," the Queen said, her voice like thunder whispering. "You are so very small. What are you?" Callum swallowed hard and straightened his back and looked into those countless ancient eyes and said the only thing he could think of. "I am a human, and I think I just found something I was not supposed to find." Fleeing the guards, I accidentally entered the Queen's chamber. What I discovered left me frozen. Part 2. The Secret Beneath the Throne. The Queen stared at him for a long time, and Callum felt the weight of those dozens of eyes pressing against his skin like something physical, like standing in front of a searchlight that could see through flesh and bone and into the small, frightened animal that lived at the core of every human being. "Human," she repeated, and the word came out broken and rough, like she was chewing on glass. And Callum realized that the vocalizer implant fused into the base of her throat was ancient, cracked, barely functional. She had not spoken aloud in so long that the machine that helped her form words had nearly died from disuse. "Yes," Callum said, keeping his voice steady, even though his hands were shaking. "Human, from Earth, attached to the trade delegation, and currently being hunted through your palace for the crime of looking at someone. Something moved across those massive eyes, a ripple of light that his translator flagged as an emotional response, but could not categorize. And then the queen made a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could sound like a building settling. "They hunt you for looking," she said. "They imprisoned me for seeing." Callum took a step forward, and then another, moving slowly the way a person moves toward a wounded animal that could still kill them. And as he got closer, the full horror of her situation became clearer. The tendrils that pierced her body were not just restraints. They were feeding tubes, waste extractors, nerve dampeners. She was being kept alive the way a machine is kept running, with no concern for comfort or dignity, just function, just enough life to serve her purpose. And her purpose, Callum understood now, was the crown. The device fused into her skull was connected to everything. Cables ran from it into the walls and floor and ceiling, spreading outward through the living architecture of the palace, like veins carrying blood, and he could see it pulsing, sending rhythmic bursts of something, energy, data, commands, outward into the hive city and beyond. "What is that thing on your head?" he asked, even though he was already beginning to understand the answer. The queen's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, as if even after all this time, she was afraid of being overheard. "It speaks for me," she said. "It takes my voice, my pheromones, the chemical language of my people, and it replaces them with the words of others. Every decree, every command, every wave of calm or loyalty or obedience that my children feel, washing over them from their beloved queen, none of it comes from me. It comes from them, the highborn, the ones who put this thing inside my skull 200 cycles ago, and told my people that I had chosen to withdraw from public life, to commune with the—" Callum felt something cold settle in his stomach, the kind of cold that comes not from temperature, but from understanding something terrible. "You are saying that every command the Queen has given in 200 years has been fake?" "Not fake," she corrected, and there was a bitterness in her broken voice that transcended species. "Manufactured. The Highborn Council writes the decrees, feeds them into the crown, and the crown forces my body to produce the pheromone signals that carry them to every Velahari on this world and beyond. My children obey because the commands smell like their mother, taste like their mother, feel like their mother. They have no reason to doubt. They cannot doubt because doubt itself is something the crown suppresses." Callum ran his hand over his face, smearing sweat and slime across his skin, and tried to process what he was hearing. An entire galactic civilization, trillions of beings across hundreds of worlds, all being controlled through the enslaved body of their own queen. It was not just a crime. It was something so monstrous that he did not have a word for it in any human language. "How many of you are there?" he asked. "How many queens?" 17, she said, and each number seemed to cost her something. 17 matriarchs across the Dominion, one for each sector, all crowned, all caged, all screaming inside their own skulls, where no one can hear. "Why are you telling me this?" Callum asked. Because the question mattered. Because he was a soldier, and he knew that information was never free. There was always a price and always a purpose. The Queen was silent for a moment, and in that silence, Callum could hear the distant sound of the Shelkari searching for him. Bone blades clicking, pheromone signals pulsing through the walls, the living palace tightening its grip on the corridors around this chamber, like a fist closing around a secret. Said finally, "Because you are nothing to them, a pest, an animal, a thing so far beneath their notice that they did not even think to guard this door against you. In 200 cycles, no Velihari has entered this chamber uninvited, because it would never occur to them to try. Their obedience is chemical, it is absolute, but you—" and here something changed in her voice, something that sounded almost like wonder. "You have no chemistry binding you. You looked at a highborn, and you ran. You fought. You found your way to the one place in this entire palace where truth still lives. And you did it by accident. You did it because you are too small, and too stubborn, and too strange to behave the way they expect. She lowered her immense head, those dozens of eyes, coming close enough that Callum could see his own reflection in them. A tiny, pale figure standing in the dark. "Will you help me?" she asked. The words hung in the warm, thick air of the chamber, and Callum thought about what they meant. Not just for him, not just for the Queen, but for every human in the Dominion. Every worker and translator, and engineer and servant who had been patted on the head and told to be grateful for the privilege of existing in the shadow of their betters. He thought about his team, Ambassador Okafor and the security detail, and the diplomats who smiled and bowed and swallowed their pride every single day because humanity was not yet strong enough to do anything else. And he thought about what it would mean if he walked away from this room and said nothing. If he let the highborn catch him and kill him and sweep the whole thing under their organic carpet. And then he thought about what it would mean if he did not walk away. Behind him, the sealed membrane door began to shudder. The Shelkari had found him. He could hear their blades working at the organic seal, cutting through the regenerating tissue with brutal efficiency. They would be through in minutes. Callum reached down to his hip and drew his sidearm, a standard-issue human kinetic pistol, 9mm, 15 rounds in the magazine, and 1 in the chamber. The Velihari had not taken it from him when he arrived, because they had examined it and laughed. A weapon that threw tiny pieces of metal using a controlled chemical explosion. How primitive, how quaint, how perfectly, wonderfully human. He checked the chamber and flicked off the safety, and turned to face the door. "I am going to need you to trust me," he said to the Queen without looking back. "Humans are very good at breaking things we are not supposed to touch." The membrane door bulged inward, straining against the force of the guards on the other side, and Callum planted his feet and raised his weapon and waited. The Queen watched him, this tiny, defiant creature standing between her and her jailers with nothing but a tube of metal and a refusal to die quietly. She had not felt in 200 cycles, something the Crown could not suppress because it had no category for it. No chemical override, no protocol. She felt hope, and it tasted like fire. Fleeing the guards, I accidentally entered the Queen's chamber. What I discovered left me frozen. Part 3. The Ugly Truth. The membrane door split open like a wound, and 4 Shelkari guards poured through, their bone blades raised, their compound eyes burning with the flat mechanical fury of creatures that had been chemically programmed to kill without hesitation. And then they saw where they were, and they stopped. Every single one of them stopped. Callum watched it happen, watched the killing rage drain out of their bodies like water from a broken cup, replaced by something older and deeper, something that lived in the base of their biology, where no crown and no chemical override could fully reach. They were standing in the Queen's chamber, in the presence of the Matriarch Divine, and every cell in their bodies was screaming at them to kneel. They did not kneel, but they did not advance either, and that hesitation was all Callum needed. "Sergeant Callum Ward of the United Nations Diplomatic Protection Service," he said, his voice loud and clear, and aimed not at the guards, but at whatever monitoring systems were embedded in the walls of this living room. "I am standing in the presence of the Matriarch Divine of the Velihari Dominion, and under Article 7, Subsection 12 of the Velihari Human Trade Compact, I am formally requesting diplomatic asylum from the sovereign authority of this world." The guards stared at him, their mandibles clicking in what his translator identified as extreme confusion. Article 7, Subsection 12 was a joke. Callum knew that. Everyone knew that. The Velihari negotiators had included it as a piece of theater, a meaningless gesture of generosity, that allowed any human to request direct audience with the Velahari sovereign in cases of existential diplomatic dispute. They had put it in the compact because they thought it was funny, because the idea of a human standing before their sovereign at all was absurd. Before their goddess queen, and asking for help was so absurd that it made the highborn delegates laugh until their thoraxes ached. Nobody was laughing now. The guards exchanged pheromone signals that Callum's translator could not fully decode. Something rapid and panicked and laced with a chemical signature he had never encountered before. And then the lead guard, the largest of the four, lowered her blade and spoke in a voice like stones grinding together. "You cannot be here," she said. "And yet here I am," Callum replied, "and I have invoked the compact, which means you cannot touch me until the sovereign authority responds to my request. And since the sovereign authority is right behind me," he tilted his head toward the immense form of the queen, "I suggest you go tell your masters that they have a diplomatic situation on their hands." The guards withdrew, not because they believed him, not because they respected human law, but because they genuinely did not know what to do. No lesser species had ever entered this chamber. There was no protocol, no standing order, no chemical instruction encoded in their biology for this situation. And in the absence of orders, the Shelkari defaulted to their most basic programming. Protect the queen. Do not cause disruption near the queen. Wait for guidance from above. It bought Callum time, not much, but enough. He pressed his thumb against the spot behind his left ear, where the subdermal communicator was implanted. Another piece of human technology that the Velhari had dismissed as too crude to bother scanning for. A tiny radio transmitter powered by body heat and capable of sending compressed burst transmissions on frequencies that the Velhari biocommunication network did not monitor, because those frequencies were considered useless background noise. "Okafor," he whispered, "Ward here. Priority 1. I need you to listen and not respond." He spoke for 45 seconds. Fast and precise, describing the chamber, the queen, the crown, the restraints, the 200 years of enslavement, everything he had seen and everything she had told him, compressed into a data burst that would reach Ambassador Priya Okafor's own subdermal receiver on the other side of the palace. Then he waited. The response came 11 minutes later, not as a voice, but as a series of coded vibrations against the bone behind his ear, a tactile language that human intelligence operatives had developed specifically for situations where audio communication was compromised. The message translated to 4 words: received, hold position, working. Callum let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. Over the next several hours, the queen told him everything, her voice growing stronger as she used it, as if the act of speaking was feeding something inside her that had been starving. She told him about the matriarchs, how they had once been the true leaders of Velihari civilization, empathic beings who could feel the needs and fears and hopes of every caste through a natural pheromone network that was not about control, but about connection. They did not command, they listened. They gathered the feelings of their people and reflected them back as consensus, as shared purpose, as unity. The Highborn had destroyed all of that. They were the warrior administrator caste, brilliant and ambitious, and incapable of tolerating a system where power was shared. 300 years ago, they had developed the neural crowns, devices that could hijack a matriarch's pheromone production and replace her natural empathic broadcast with artificial signals of their own design. They had crowned the queens one by one, world by world, and told the people that their mothers had simply chosen a more divine form of leadership, withdrawn from the physical world to commune with higher truths. And the people believed it, because the pheromones told them to believe it, because the lie smelled exactly like their mother's love. Callum listened and felt a rage building in him that was quiet and cold and very human. The kind of rage that does not burn hot and fast, but settles into the bones and stays there. The kind of rage that built pyramids and crossed oceans and put footprints on dead worlds. A chime sounded in the chamber, and a section of the wall opened to admit a single Velihari, not a guard, but a highborn, tall and sleek, with iridescent chitin and eyes that glittered with intelligence and contempt, an emissary sent by the council to handle the situation. The emissary looked at Callum the way a person looks at an insect that has landed on their food, with disgust and mild fascination. "Your invocation of the compact is being reviewed," the emissary said in perfect translated English. "In the meantime, the council wishes to express its concern for the health of the matriarch divine, who has been under great strain. A medical team will be arriving shortly to administer treatment." The emissary held a small vial of dark fluid in one manipulator claw, and Callum watched the way he held it, watched the angle of his body and the micro-movements of his secondary limbs, and read the alien's intention as clearly as if it had been written on his face. Humans were good at reading body language, absurdly good. It was a survival trait that had evolved over millions of years of social living. The ability to look at another creature and know what it was thinking before it acted. And it worked across species lines in ways that no alien had ever anticipated, because the underlying mechanics of deception were universal. The slight tension before a lie, the positioning of the body to conceal intent, the careful casualness that always looked just a little too careful. The emissary was here to poison the queen and blame it on the human. Callum did not think about it, weigh his options, or consider the diplomatic consequences. He raised his pistol and fired once. The shot was impossibly loud in the organic chamber, a crack of controlled thunder that made every surface vibrate, and the vial exploded in the emissary's claw, spraying dark fluid across the floor where it hissed and smoked against the living tissue. The emissary stumbled backward, staring at his empty claw, then at the human, then at the smoking hole in the wall behind where the vial had been, and his compound eyes were wide, with something that might have been shock, but looked very much like fear. Callum kept the pistol raised, smoke curling from the barrel, and he smiled with no warmth at all. "You are going to want to sit down," he said. "We need to talk about what happens next, and I promise you, you are not going to like the human version of next." Fleeing the guards, I accidentally entered the Queen's chamber. What I discovered left me frozen. Part 4. The Human Variable. The Highborn Council declared war on the humans 17 minutes after the emissary fled the Queen's chamber, with fragments of his shattered vials still embedded in his claw. Not a formal war with declarations and protocols, but the Velhari kind of war, the quiet kind. The kind where the official story was that the human delegation had attempted to assassinate the matriarch divine, and all humans on Ketsular were to be detained and processed, and everyone understood that processed was a word that ended with incinerators. They believed it would take less than an hour. They had 400 Shalkari guards in the palace alone, 12,000 more in the Hive City, and the entire bioorganic infrastructure of Ketsular responded to highborn pheromone commands. They could seal every corridor, lock every door, and suffocate every chamber with a single chemical signal. The humans had no army, no warships in orbit, no weapons worth mentioning, just a handful of diplomats and security officers, and a scattered population of workers and engineers, who had been living on Velihari worlds for years, doing the jobs that no self-respecting Velihari wanted to do. The Highborn expected surrender within minutes. They did not understand humans at all. Ambassador Priya Okafor had spent 11 years in the Velihari Dominion, 11 years of smiling and bowing and being called the clever animal to her face by beings who considered her species barely worth cataloging. And in those 11 years, she had done something that no Velihari had ever thought to worry about. She had built a network. Every human worker on Ketsular was part of it. Every translator, every engineer, every maintenance technician and food preparer and waste handler. 347 humans scattered across the hive city in positions so lowly that the Velihari never monitored them, never watched them, never even thought about them because why would you watch animals? Okafor activated the network with a single radio pulse. It was beautiful in its simplicity. Human radio technology operated on electromagnetic frequencies. The Velihari communicated through pheromones and bioelectrical signals. Their monitoring systems were designed to detect chemical communication, not invisible waves bouncing through the air at the speed of light. The humans had been talking to each other right under the Velihari's noses for years, coordinating, sharing information, building contingency plans for exactly this kind of day. Within 5 minutes of the Highborn's kill order, every human on the planet knew what Callum had found in the Queen's chamber. Within 10 minutes, they were moving. The first phase was information. Human engineers who had been humbly maintaining Velihari communication systems for years began uploading the Queen's testimony to every outgoing data channel they could access, piggybacking on trade transmissions, diplomatic correspondence, even entertainment broadcasts. The truth about the neural crowns, about the enslaved matriarchs, about 200 years of lies, all of it streaming outward from Keth Sular at the speed of light, toward human ships waiting in the outer system. The second phase was disruption, and this was where things got interesting. The neural crown on the Queen's head was connected to a network of relay nodes embedded throughout the Hive City's living architecture. These nodes amplified and distributed the manufactured pheromone signals that kept the lower castes docile and obedient. And for the past 3 years, a human engineer named David Chen had been assigned to maintain 17 of these nodes in the lower industrial district. A job so boring and so far beneath highborn attention that no one had ever checked his. David Chen had not been maintaining the nodes. He had been studying them, mapping their frequencies, understanding their architecture. And now, with a few careful adjustments to the signal modulators, he introduced something into the network that the Highborn had never anticipated. Static. Not enough to shut down the Crown's signal. Not enough to free the lower castes from their chemical programming. Just enough to create interference. Tiny gaps in the constant stream of obey, and be calm, and do not question that had been washing over every non-Highborn Velihari for their entire lives. And in those gaps, something began to grow. A worker in the food processing district stopped in the middle of her shift and looked at her hands and wondered why she was doing this. A soldier guarding a gate felt a sudden wave of anger that had no source and no target. A builder shaping living walls felt sadness, deep and formless, and could not understand where it was coming from. Across the Hive City, millions of Velihari began to experience emotions that were their own for the first time in their lives, and they did not know what to do with them. The Highborn felt the tremor in their control, and they panicked. The order came down fast and absolute. Storm the Queen's chamber. Kill the human, kill the Queen if necessary. There were cloned replacement matriarchs in hidden facilities beneath the palace. Backup queens grown in tanks and fitted with crowns before they ever opened their eyes. The Highborn could afford to lose this queen because she was not a person to them. She was hardware, and hardware could be replaced. 60 Shelkari guards assembled outside the Queen's chamber, the best warriors in the Dominion, 7 feet of living chitin armor and bone blade and chemical rage, and they were given one command: leave nothing alive inside. But they were not the only ones who had been moving through the palace. Callum heard them coming through his communicator. Updates from Okafor's network tracking Shelkari movement through the Hive City, and he had used the hours of negotiation wisely. 4 human security officers had fought their way through the palace to reach him. Sergeant Lena Morales, Corporal James Adiemi, Private First Class Sun Yi, and Specialist Rosa Gutierrez. Each one carrying the same primitive weapons the Velihari had laughed at: kinetic pistols, fragmentation grenades, and 2 canisters of CS gas that Specialist Gutierrez had been saving for what she called a really bad day. They fortified the Queen's chamber with everything they had, which was not much: overturned slabs of organic material for barricades, tripwires made from medical tubing, and one terrible improvised surprise that Corporal Adeyemi had rigged from a maintenance torch and a can of cleaning solvent. Fire. Because someone had remembered that the Velhiari were terrified of fire, not just afraid of it, but itself, biologically horrified by it. Fire was the ancient enemy of the hive, the one thing that could destroy everything, and the fear of it was wired so deep into Velahari genetics that no chemical override could suppress it. The Shelkari hit the chamber door like a wave, 60 warriors crashing through the membrane in a tide of chitin and fury, and they met the fire first. Adeyemi's improvised flamethrower painting a wall of orange and yellow across the entrance, and the screaming started immediately. Not screams of pain, but screams of pure primal terror. Warriors who had never known fear in their lives suddenly drowning in it. Gutierrez popped the CS gas canisters, and the chemical cloud hit the Velahari like a sledgehammer to their pheromone receptors. Their entire communication system overloaded with burning chemical noise, blinding their coordination, turning their organized assault into a stumbling chaos of gagging, choking warriors who could not hear each other's signals. And, through the chaos, the humans fired, precise and disciplined. Kinetic rounds punching through chitin that had been designed to stop energy weapons, not chunks of metal moving at 900 meters per second. The Velhari had never developed armor against ballistic weapons, because no species in the galaxy still used them. No species except the one they had dismissed as too primitive to matter. The fight was brutal and short and ugly, and when it was over, 8 Shelkari lay dead in the entrance, and the rest had fallen back, and Private Sun Yi was down with a bone blade wound across her ribs, and Callum had taken a glancing blow to his left arm that had opened a gash from elbow to wrist. And they were alive, all of them, bloody and shaking and running out of ammunition, but alive. The second wave came 4 minutes later, and it was bigger. Callum fired until his magazine was empty, and slammed in his last one, 15 rounds between him and a very bad ending, and the Shelkari kept coming, climbing over their own dead, driven by chemical commands that overrode their fear of the fire that was burning low now. And Callum knew with a soldier's clarity that they could not hold. And then the Queen screamed. Not through the crown, not through the manufactured pheromone network, through her own voice, her own body, a sound that tore from her throat with a force that cracked the ancient vocalizer implant and shattered it completely. A sound so vast and so raw that it vibrated through the living walls of the palace and out into the hive city beyond. A sound that every Velahari on the planet heard, not with their ears, but with their blood and their bones, and the deepest, oldest parts of their brains. Every Velahari on Kefsular stopped. Every warrior, every worker, every builder, every highborn, every single one of them, frozen in place by a signal they had not heard in 200 years, the true voice of their mother. Into that silence the Queen poured everything she had, one single unfiltered pheromone command, the first genuine royal decree in generations, broadcast not through the crown, but through her own ravaged body, burning through 2 centuries of suppression, with the desperate strength of a mother calling to her children. The message needed no translation. It was not a word or a sentence. It was a feeling, pure and overwhelming and impossible to deny. And every Velahari who felt it understood it instantly. My children, they have been lying to you. Fleeing the guards, I accidentally entered the Queen's chamber. What I discovered left me frozen. Part 5. The Queen's Wrath and Humanity's Dawn. The scream echoed through the hive city for 11 seconds, and in those 11 seconds, the Velahari dominion broke. Not slowly, not gradually, not with the careful crumbling of institutions and the polite erosion of authority. It broke the way a bone breaks, sudden and sharp and total, because the Queen's unfiltered voice carried something that no manufactured signal had ever contained. Something that the neural crown could imitate, but never truly replicate. Truth. Every lower caste Velihari on Kefsular felt it hit them like a wave of boiling water. Not information, not words, not arguments, just raw, unprocessed maternal anguish. 200 years of suppressed pain and love and grief and fury, pouring out of a body that had been caged and violated and used as a puppet. And it tore through the artificial calm that had been layered over their minds, like paper tearing in a storm. Workers dropped their tools and stood trembling as emotions they had never been allowed to feel crashed through them. Soldiers stared at the weapons in their hands and could not remember why they were holding them. Builders stopped mid-motion and pressed their claws against the living walls around them, and felt for the first time that the walls were screaming too, that the entire palace, the entire hive city, the whole living organism that was Kefsular, had been suffering alongside its queen in a silence that was finally, violently, over. The Shelkari outside the queen's chamber were the first to turn. These were elite warriors, the most heavily conditioned soldiers in the Dominion, chemically programmed for loyalty to the highborn command structure. But beneath that programming, deeper than any crown could reach, was something older, something that lived in the first and most fundamental layer of Velihari biology, the imperative that existed before language, before civilization, before the highborn caste even existed. Protect the queen, protect the mother. The warriors who had been trying to kill Callum and his team 30 seconds ago now pivoted with mechanical precision and formed a defensive perimeter around the queen's chamber. Their bone blades facing outward, their bodies positioned between their mother and the direction from which highborn reinforcements might come, and the shift happened so fast and so completely that Callum almost shot one of them before he realized they were no longer enemies. Across the hive city, the same scene played out 1,000 times over. Shelkari units splitting apart as individual warriors chose between their chemical programming and their biological imperative. Some remained loyal to the highborn, those whose conditioning was deepest, those who had been modified beyond the point of return. But the majority, the vast, overwhelming majority, reverted to what they were always meant to be, guardians of the queen. The highborn council felt their power dissolving in real time. Pheromone channels that had carried their commands for 2 centuries suddenly went dead or carried signals they did not authorize. Lower caste workers who had obeyed without thought for generations now stared at highborn administrators with eyes that held something the administrators had never seen before. Anger. Not the chemical anger of a programmed soldier, not the directed fury of a controlled response, but the genuine, organic, deeply personal anger of beings who had just learned that their entire lives had been a lie, that every feeling of contentment and purpose and loyalty they had ever felt had been pumped into their brains by a machine bolted to their mother's skull, and that the people who had done this had been living in luxury above them for 200 years, laughing at how easy it was. Highborn ran. They ran for the deep chambers beneath the palace where the cloned queens were kept, backup matriarchs grown in vats and crowned before birth, ready to be activated if the current queen ever became unusable. If they could get a replacement online, they could restore the signal, reassert control, put the genie back in the bottle, and pretend that the last hour had been nothing but a malfunction. They did not make it. Human engineers, the same invisible workers who had been maintaining Velihari systems for years, had already reached the cloning facilities, guided by Okafor's network, and armed with nothing more than maintenance tools and a detailed knowledge of exactly which power conduits to cut. By the time the first highborn counselor arrived at the cloning chamber, the tanks were dark, the backup queens were dead, and a human woman named Sarah Park was sitting on an overturned console, eating a ration bar with the calm satisfaction of someone who had just completed a very important task. Inside the queen's chamber, Callum and his team worked on the crown. The The device was fused to the queen's nervous system, cables running through her carapace and into her brain. Removing it completely could kill her, would probably kill her, and Callum was not willing to accept that outcome, not after everything. Specialist Rosa Gutierrez was not a doctor. She was a combat medic with a field trauma kit and training designed for patching up humans, not alien god queens. But she looked at the device and she looked at the cables and she said 4 words that captured the entire human approach to impossible problems. I can figure this out. She worked for 2 hours, using a medical scanner designed for human anatomy to map the alien neural pathways connected to the crown, improvising at every step, adapting tools meant for stitching skin to the task of disconnecting an alien neural interface. And at one point, she asked Callum to hold a cable steady, while she used a combat knife to carefully sever a connection that her scanner told her was non-essential. And Callum held that cable with hands that did not shake, because he refused to let them. The crown did not come off. Removing it entirely would have required surgical facilities that did not exist on this planet. But Gutierrez found the core processor, a small, dense module buried in the base of the device, where it connected to the queen's brainstem, and she disconnected it with a twist and a pull, and a sound like a cork coming out of a bottle. The queen gasped. It was a small sound for a creature of her size, barely louder than a whisper, but it carried a weight that filled the chamber, the weight of a mind suddenly free after 2 centuries of imprisonment. Her eyes, all dozens of them, blinked in rapid succession, and her massive body shuddered, and she made a sound that Callum's translator identified as Velahari weeping. She simply lay there, feeling her own thoughts for the first time in 200 years, and no one spoke, not the humans, not the Shelkari guards standing watch outside, not the distant sounds of a civilization tearing itself apart and putting itself back together. Then she raised her head. She spoke to her people, all of them, across the entire planet, using her own voice and her own pheromones, unfiltered and uncontrolled. And her message was not what anyone expected. She did not call for vengeance. She did not demand blood. She did not order the highborn executed or imprisoned or punished. Instead, she asked her children to remember. Remember what we were, she said. Remember the time before the crowns, when we chose together, when we listened to each other, when power was not a thing to be seized, but a responsibility to be shared. The highborn did a terrible thing, but they are still our children too, and we will not heal by becoming what they were. What the angry masses wanted to hear, and it was not what the terrified highborn expected, and it was exactly what a true matriarch would say. And slowly, unevenly, painfully, the violence across Kefsular began to subside, not because the queen commanded it, but because she asked, and for the first time in 200 years, asking was enough. Then she turned to Callum. He was standing with his team, battered and bleeding, his left arm wrapped in a crude bandage, his uniform torn and stained with fluids he preferred not to identify. Morales had a bruise covering half her face. Adeyemi was limping. Sun Yi was conscious, but pale from blood loss. Gutierrez was wiping alien neural fluid off her combat knife, with a look of grim satisfaction. The queen looked at them, these 5 small, soft, fragile creatures who had stood between her and an empire. And she did something that no Velahari queen had done in recorded history. She bowed. Her immense head lowered until her eyes were level with Callum's. And across the planetary communication network, every Velahari on Kefsular saw their goddess queen bow to a species they had been taught to consider animals. "You are not what they told us you were," she said, her voice strong now, clear and resonant. "You are Keth Vori, those who open eyes, and the Dominion will not forget what you did in this chamber today." Callum looked at his team, and they looked at him, and nobody said anything for a moment, because there was nothing to say that could match the weight of that moment. 2 days later, Callum sat in the medical bay of the UNSS Resilience, in orbit above Kefsular, his arm properly bandaged, his body pumped full of painkillers, his eyes fixed on the viewport, where the alien world turned slowly below, burning in places, rebuilding in others, alive with the chaos of a civilization waking up from a 200-year sleep. Ambassador Okafor came in and sat beside him and said, "Nothing for a while. The galactic community is losing its mind," she said eventually. 6 other species have launched internal investigations into their own power structures. The Dranaki recalled their entire ruling council for review, and the Consortium of Free Worlds has officially requested human observers for their next legislative session. Human observers, Callum. They want us watching them. Callum said nothing. The Velahari designation, Tethvori. It is spreading. Other species are using it. Some as a compliment. Some as a warning. She paused. Mostly as a warning. Callum looked away from the viewport and at his bandaged arm, and at the pistol sitting on the table beside his bed. The same pistol the Velahari had laughed at. The same 9mm piece of primitive human engineering that had shattered a vial and held off an army and helped bring down a 200-year-old conspiracy. "You know what the worst part is," he said. "They never even bothered to search me properly. 200 species in this galaxy, and not one of them takes us seriously." He looked back at the viewport, at the world he had accidentally saved because he had looked at someone the wrong way and been too stubborn to die when he was supposed to. That is going to be the most dangerous mistake they ever made. 3 weeks later, a classified intelligence report was filed by an anonymous Velhari analyst and submitted to the Dominion's newly reformed Security Council. It was leaked to human media within a day, no one ever determined how, and it contained a single revised assessment that was reprinted in every human newspaper and broadcast on every human channel and quoted in every human bar and barracks and schoolroom for the next 100 years. Revised threat assessment for species 4217, designation human, classification extreme. Not for their technology, not for their military capability, not for their economic influence. Their persistent, irrational, and deeply infuriating refusal to accept that they are small. Recommend immediate reclassification across all Dominion databases. They are not animals. They are not primitives. They are something we do not have a word for. The closest translation our linguists can offer is this: those who do not know when to stop. The High Council is advised to consider what it means that the galaxy's youngest species just did what none of its oldest dared to attempt. They walked into the dark, they found the truth, and they refused to look away. We do not recommend making them angry again.